thinking about our last of the avot, um, and the characteristics that he has, I certainly thought of him in a even more passive than Rebecca said kind of way, sort of like really not taking action at all. But I think that was probably unfair, especially given, right, as Nahama said, like, the Akeda happened to him, right? There's a lot, there's even a midrash that says that Yitzhak actually died at the Akeda, and that he then came back to life, right, to lead this sort of different life than he maybe had mapped out for him or himself, or that God had mapped out for him before the Akeda. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Grummet, who's a scholar in Israel, argues that the avot are they're the Baal of the characteristic that they need, not the one that they have. Right. So Abraham, we call the Baal Chesed, and of course he did a lot of Chesed, but as we sort of touched upon last week, there were times where he lacked that Chesed characteristic. And so Yitzhak is associated with Gvura, but maybe it's not that he had a lot of internal strength, but that he needed a lot of strength, like given Akeda, given having these warring brothers, sons under him. And so maybe he doesn't have so much gvura. But what I do want to argue today is I think that he has the gvura of love, of loving like in a very fierce and unconditional kind of way, that was not part of his family narrative necessarily beforehand. And so I want us to look at that piece.
Can I interject?
Yeah, please.
Yitzhak played a really important role in connecting these two strong personalities of Abraham and Yaakov. And that is a strength and power that often gets overlooked. To stay in the land, to hang in there, to not run away. That's a big thing too. So I want to put that in his corner as well.
Yes, I think that's a great point. I heard a shir last year about how Yitzhak is the bridge generation, and that is a hard role to play. So thank you. Yes, I think maybe the way to think about it is many of Yitzhak's strengths are rather quiet or sort of unassuming. And so that is one of the strengths. And I think that the love piece is another strength that we can see. So even though we are starting Shabbat Parsha Toldot, we're going to look just to the last pasuk of the last week's Parsha for a moment, because Yitzchak's sort of like publicly discussed love in the Torah starts with Rivka. So, right, we read the part about how Rivka decides to leave Haran and to come to marry Yitzhak. And it then says that, right, Yitzhak ohela Sarah imo, he brings Rivka into the tent of his mother Sarah, v'yikach et Rivka, v'tihi lo li'isha, and he takes her to be a wife, all of which is sort of standard practice, I would say, in the Torah. And then it says v'ye'ahaveha, right, that Yitzhak loved Rivka. And somehow that love or that partnership is v'yanachem Yitzhak acharei imo, that he finds comfort after his mother's death. So he doesn't just marry Rivka, but he loves her also. And the Kedushat Levi, who is Levi Yitzchak of Berdechev, a Hasidic master, talks about how there are two different kinds of love that you can find in marriage. And Yitzchak mainly demonstrates what we would call like the higher love. Right. And so here he talks about how, right, Yitzhak brings her, and we need to examine what the Torah means when it says that Yitzhak loved Rivka, and that it is so extraordinary that it needs to be spelled out here in the Torah, right? Which is interesting in and of itself. The Kedushat Levi assumes if he just loved her, Abraham loved Sarah, it's just love. There has to be something really extraordinary about this love to qualify for being stated out in the text. And so he says here, right, a husband can love his wife, or vice versa, I would argue, on two different levels. He may love her, i.e. be physically attracted to her because she enables him to satisfy his biological urges. And if this is love, it is not love at all. It is merely a love of his self, right? That this sort of physical attraction love is not really the love of that we're striving for in life. And there are husbands who do not love their wives because they are instruments of fulfilling their physical desires, but because their wives enable them to perform the Creator's will better and more profoundly. And this is the true meaning of someone loving his wife. And therefore, the Torah must be talking about this kind of love. That right, that it's somehow nechamat shehi kli lekayem al yada mitzvat habara yitbarach shemo kamo she'adam ohev sha'ar mitzvot v'zeh nikra ohev et ishto. Right, that there's this idea that the love helps you be stronger or better. Right, it's like I would say maybe an inspiring love. And I do think that fits into that vayinachem category, right? The love somehow comforted him and it helped him be stronger or better because he felt that comfort and that love from her. As opposed to a more, maybe I would call it a superficial instead of a physical love. You love that your wife takes care of you, or you love that, she goes to dinner parties with you, or you love going out with her, but it's not a love that inspires you to take on more mitzvot or inspires you to find more connection in the world. It's a more basic love. And that Yitzhak, as this is part of his gvura, is that he's able to love in this much more profound way. But I open that for thoughts. And I think that one of the ways that we see this like really deep love is now here in our week's Parsha, is when Yitzhak is davening for Rivka so that she should have a child. Right, and here we like already just by knowing that Yitzhak davens for Rivka, we see a deviation from the way that his father behaved, right? Because Abraham notably does not daven for Sarah when Sarah is barren. He davens for lots of other people, and we even connect. We say, right, that when you daven for someone else, your own wishes get fulfilled, but you're still not actually davening for that person. And so here we see that Yitzhak is choosing another path, right? And we even see it, maybe it skips a generation, right? Yaakov gets upset when Rachel complains about being barren, right? Saying that like he can't play the role of God. But here it's Yitzhak shows this love, right? So the pasuk says v'yater Yitzhak laHashem, translated here as Isaac pleaded with the Lord, l'nochach ishto ki akarahi v'yater lo Hashem v'tahar Rivka ishto, and God responds to that plea, and Rivka has a child. And the Radak notes the strength of the word v'yater. V'yater Yitzchak means harbe b'tfila al ishto sheteled lefi shehaya ohevota ahava yetera kamo shepirashnu. Right, that he davens like very hard that his wife should have a child because he loved her very much. And this is definitely an editorial note. It doesn't say it here, but he would not consider marrying anyone in addition to her. This is in the Sfaria translation, this editorial note. And I think what it's pointing to, right, is that when Abraham doesn't have a child, right, he takes Hagar. Even if Sarah is the one who tells him to, he doesn't say, no, sweetheart, I love you the most. I want to have your baby. He says, okay, I'll take Hagar, like anything to get the covenantal line to continue. And Yitzhak is saying, no, I don't want a child. I want Rivka to have a child, right? There's no second chance in asking for a child from somewhere else, right? And the Radak goes on that lo ratza lakachat isha acheret aleha, right? She doesn't want to take on another person. V'lo achat min aroteha, right? I think a deliberate nod to Hagar, not one of her handmaids. Lefichach harbe ma'od b'tfila ad shena'ater lo hakel. And so he davened so much until God answered him, because he was saying, I love Rivka sort of unconditionally, right? Whether she's barren or not. And so if I want to have this covenantal child, I need you, God, to give that child to Rivka. And I think that there's something very powerful in thinking that family is not really dispensable, right? Like you could read Abraham, maybe uncharitably, right? He doesn't get the wife who has the kid, so he gets Hagar. He doesn't like, or Sarah doesn't like his first son, so he sends him away. God tells him to sacrifice Yitzhak, so he says, okay, I'll sacrifice Yitzhak, right? There's like a little bit of a transitory, maybe even nature to Abraham. Like I wouldn't say, I don't want to say that he's willing to just think of people as dispensable, but it seems almost to me, and maybe this is like Abraham's own survivor nature based on having to leave his own family and land. Like he doesn't connect so deeply to people in a way that would cause him, Abraham, to fight with God for his own relatives. Right? Even with Lot, he and Lot have a disagreement. He says, okay, you go your way, I'll go my way. And Yitzhak is, I think, saying like, it doesn't work that way for me. I love Rivka. And that's why he davens with this vayat nature, this pleading. And then once we see Rivka have children, we see again, I think, Yitzhak showing a very fierce and unconditional love for his children. Right, because again, we have V'yahav Yitzhak et Esav, right? We never learn that Abraham loves Yishmael or Yitzhak, but Yitzhak loves Esav, Ki Tzayid B'fiv, which we'll explore, right? But because either he had a taste for game or because that, he Yitzhak, or because Esav captured the game for him. V'Rivka ohevet et Yaakov. And Rivka favored Yaakov. And Rashi here explains, like it troubles our traditional commentaries because we've decided to make Esav not just like a complicated person, but maybe a villain. And so why would Yitzhak be rooting for like the wrong team, right? Esav is like the brute who's out in the field. Yaakov is the covenantal child who learns Torah and like the, Beit Midrash of Shem ve'ever. And so why on earth is Yitzhak choosing the wrong child to love? And so Rashi, trying to understand it, he explains that maybe Ki Tzayid B'fiv is about a conditional love, right? That Yitzhak loves Esav because he brings him food, right? Ketargumo B'fiv shel Yitzhak, umidrasho B'fiv shel Yitzhak, right? That Yitzhak really liked eating meat. And Yaakov wasn't bringing home meat. So he loved him because he did this nice thing for him. Maybe that superficial love that Kedusha Levi talks about. Because obviously, according to Rashi, Yitzhak can't love Esav unconditionally. That just doesn't make any sense. And so too, Rashi explains, right? Like the deeper meaning, the midrash meaning of Befiv is Befiv shel Esav. Shahayat sad oto umiramehu b'dvarav, that the hunting is in Esav's mouth, that he entraps and deceives Yitzhak, right? So that makes more sense. Yitzhak is like an old doddering, perhaps blind, right, guy who gets taken advantage of, as opposed to being someone who sees Esav and loves him anyway. And I think that despite Yitzhak maybe being blind, seeing him as like emotionally blind doesn't really fit with the context of loving Rivka above, right? Yitzhak is a guy who really sees love where it is. And so why would he suddenly lose it? And I think that the proof for this is in the bracha that he gives Esav, right? Because Yitzhak, right? So Yaakov comes in pretending to be Esav, and Yitzhak gives that person, that son, a bracha. And this is the bracha that we assume he meant to give to Esav, right? Even though he gives it to Yaakov. And it is a good bracha. And we can see it here. Right, he says, "V'yitin lecha ha'elokim mital hashamayim lishomnei haaretz v'rov dagan v'tirash," that you'll have this abundance of grain and wine from the dew of the heaven and the fat of the earth. Ya'avducha amim v'yishtachavu lecha leumim, right, that people will bow down to you. Have a gvir la'achecha, you'll be the master over your brothers. V'yishtachavu lecha b'nei imecha, your mother's children, i.e., your brothers, will bow down to you. Right, and so that is I think that's a pretty good bracha, right? Thinking that Yitzhak, I think we assume it's good because we know that it's Yaakov, and Yaakov deserves this big bracha, but really in the shot of the text, Yitzhak doesn't know that Yaakov has switched places with Esav, and this is the bracha he wanted to give his firstborn, his hunter in the field, right? His son, who this is how his son relates to the world. And in fact, the bracha that Yitzhak gives Yaakov later, when he knows that he's actually giving Yaakov a bracha, is like, I think, a little bit uninspired, not loving. It's a covenantal bracha, right? V'yithimecha et birkat Avraham, l'cha u'lezarecha itach l'rishta et ha'aretz megurecha asher natan Elokim Avraham. This is all about Yaakov as part of the chain, right? This is the covenantal bracha. But there's nothing about abundance. There's nothing about this sort of relationship and mastery in the world. I think that Yitzhak wants to give Esav this success, wealth, power. And Yaakov, even unfortunately, a Yaakov who maybe lies and cheats to get what he wants to give him the covenantal bracha. And so I think the real question, right, then is why, and we're not going to get it from our traditional commentaries, right? Why does Yitzhak love Esav with this open love that causes him to give this bracha? And not this bracha? You would have thought that Esav is the oldest child. This should have been the bracha they started with, this covenantal bracha, but he gives this really different bracha. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, from 2 years ago in Parshat Toldot, he says he imagines the words of Yitzhak. So speaking in the first person as though he is Yitzhak, Rabbi Sachs writes, "My love for my son is unconditional. I do not ignore who or what he is, but I will love him anyway, even if I do not love everything he does, because that is how God loves us, unconditionally, even if he does not love everything we do. I will bless him. I will hold him close. And I believe that one day that love may make him a better person than he might otherwise have been." I find this a very emotional thought to think, right? As a parent, to think that you don't always love, or as a spouse or a friend, right? You don't always love everything about a person. Maybe Yitzhak wished that Esav did come in from the field more, or didn't hunt so much, or did learn some Torah, or whatever the thing is. But that he loves Esav the way that he believes there is some kind of divine love, that God loves us unconditionally, even if he does not love everything we do. And so too, Yitzhak tries to embrace that behavior, that pattern, to see that there is this sort of unconditional way of loving someone you don't always love. Yes, Nechama.
Well, I'm precisely that it is placed in a conditional terminology.
Okay.
That Yitzhak loved him beside the fee. However, Rashi does a nice little end run around there, but it is conditional. In contrast to Rivka, which is she loves Yaakov, period.
Yeah.
So I don't quite see how. I understand what Rabbi Sachs is saying, and that's it's compelling, but it's not persuasive really, because it does it's written as conditional love, not the unconditional love is Rivka's love. That's one thing. Another thing, the idea of Esav as the hunter, it's very strange because the avot were all pastoralists. They had flocks and and took care of them. They did not go out hunting. That was an unusual aspect, and a kind of a negative thing about Esav. We're not hunters.
Mm-hmm.
That's never glorified. So, did Yitzhak kind of admire his son for being a predator and for taking action? I don't know. I think that's part of it.
Well, maybe because he wasn't a hunter. Maybe he wished he.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Sometimes we see things in our children that we wish came from us, but we know it doesn't really, right? That's definitely true.
More often we see things of us and our kids that we don't like.
Yeah. We wish it didn't
Uh,
go transmit.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Nechama. I think certainly, I wonder if there's a difference between unconditional and unqualified, right? This is a qualifier for sure. Kitzai Bafiv. And yes, Rivka doesn't have a qualifier for Yaakov. Although, what would that qualifier be? Even when he's deceitful, right? Even when, like, I don't know. I think that maybe not that she needed a qualifier, but that I think, that just because Yaakov's deficit is not stated out here in the Pasuk doesn't mean he doesn't have them. And so I wonder if it means almost ve'ahav Yitzchak et Esav despite Said Bafiv. It's certainly not a pshat read.
Oh. I just want to throw in an insight that I got from one of my students many years ago when I was teaching fourth grade at the Hebrew Day School. And I asked the students to contrast the love of Yitzhak and the love of Rivka. And one of the students pointed out that with Yitzhak, it's in the past tense that he loved Esav. But with Rivka, it's ohevet. It's more of an enduring thing. So I like that very much. I had not noticed that.
That's interesting. Yeah. And right, the English sort of flattens that, but you're right.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that love is complicated, right? Rabbi Hirsch writes like a lot about how bad this is on both parents, that you shouldn't, pick one child to love over the other. And so certainly there are many parenting mistakes in the story of Yitzhak and Rivka with their children. But I do think that the bracha that Yitzhak gives who he thought was Esav, to me is like compelling that he loved Esav on some level deeply.
Right. It's a very nice bracha, but Esav, that Yitzhak recognized on some level that Esav was not going to get the covenantal blessing.
Yes.
And this was a very nice blessing, all kinds of things. The blessing that's given to Yaakov is a blessing, but it's a huge responsibility.
Definitely.
And sometimes that blessing can be a huge burden.
Yes. And I think that to me, that underscores the point. Yitzhak didn't love Esav blindly. He loved him unconditionally, I would argue. So he saw that Esav was not going to be the covenantal child, but instead of sending that child away with the child's mother, right, as Abraham did, he said, well, I want to make space for you, Esav, to have your strengths, which have to do with the land and the earth and not the covenant. And so I want you to have a bracha that is fit for you and all of your characteristics, which are both strengths and weaknesses. I think is a strong thing to say. I think that Yitzhak is reacting to Abraham a little bit in his parenting, which I know I certainly react to the way my parents raised me when I think about child rearing. And I do think that there's this piece of like children who weren't perfect or people who didn't fit into the narrative get sent away without a bracha. And here Yitzhak is saying, look, you're not my covenantal child. It's just not going to happen. Even though you're the oldest, you have this Sayyid Bafiv. This is not your strength, but I'm going to give you a beautiful bracha that helps you be the strongest person you are. And that's something worth copying, maybe is what I would say, right? That's understanding people's strengths and weaknesses and letting them be the best them that they can be is like a admirable quality that maybe Abraham did not always possess. And Yitzhak, in reaction, building on his maybe, although I think it's like tenuous, right? Because who knows what he and Rivka feel like after this whole story has blown over, but maybe using his love the love that he found with Rivka, he's able to find this love for Esav that's not like straightforward or obvious, but is still like gives his own son strength. And I think that that ties back into this Be'er Lahairoi piece, right? Which is that at the end of the Parsha where Abraham dies, Yitzhak, right, is in Be'er Lahairoi, which is where Hagar had been sent away to. And there's a midrash, right? I think I referenced this last time, that Yitzhak had gone to find Hagar, maybe to dwell just sort of peaceably alongside her, because he lives there for a long time, but also he had gone to find her because when he heard that his own mother had died, he didn't want Abraham to be alone. And I think that the midrash is really picking up on that like PTSD of people being left behind and him perhaps being left on the altar in some way, and that Yitzchak like feared being alone, and so he loved Rivka and maybe he loved Esav because they were there for him. They were like a presence for him, and he really needed that presence. And it doesn't ever say that he stops loving Rivka, even though she does things that are maybe deceitful to him. Right? I think that Yitzhak is willing to hold on to love even when it becomes a little bit messy, and that is maybe the thing that I think is worth emulating in Yitzhak. May we all find that love for ourselves and for each other and our families, which are usually our messiest loves. This is the last of this series. If there are people who are interested in continuing some kinds of, I'm going to stop the share, some kinds of Parsha